Okay, so welcome again, and just wanted to give you an overview of what our assessment webinar feedback series looks like. So this week we're going to be talking about 2 tips regarding the 1 in 4 rule and student reflection and assessment. Next Thursday we'll be continuing on with feedback, looking at the use of technology tools strategically, as well as peer feedback and assessment. And then we'll be moving into our 3rd week looking at recognizing busy work and how to have students show their best work. And then our final session will be thinking about distance learning and how formative and summative assessment can be done online in an online environment, which is where we're at this point in time, and also thinking about the options for the future. So every Thursday at the same time, we'll be hosting a webinar, and we invite you to join us each week. So we wanted to start off this morning with a little piece of interaction. So Vanessa is actually going to put a poll up in the chat. If you see the poll, please feel free to answer our question right in there. But our question for you is, how are you feeling about assessing your students online at this point? If you are doing that, how are you feeling? Are you feeling confident? Are you feeling like you're developing confidence? Or maybe you're not quite there yet with that growth mindset. So we're seeing some results coming in. If you
that's awesome. And while we wait for the results, Kelly, I'll maybe just mention that if you're unable to submit your response in the chat, it looks like quite a few are, which is awesome. But if not, you might have to go into your chat bubble in Teams and click on the 3 dots. And then you can either search for an app by clicking on Find an App or click on More Apps and look for the one that's called Polly. It looks like a little parrot, kind of a parrot icon. And if you add that, then you should be able to submit your response in the chat survey. But when we were experimenting, we found that those of us that didn't have that already added couldn't respond to the survey, whereas those that did could. So that's just a tip if you need it.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. So at this point, we are looking at a large number of our attendees are developing confidence, and we hope that the series that we have will support you in moving more into the feeling more confident. And those of you who are at the not yet, thank you for having the growth mindset, and we will support you through this. Also wanted to mention that we have actually brought in some teachers specifically who volunteered to talk about some of the different aspects of feedback and assessment. So we'll have voice of some teachers, but we will also invite you to jump in the chat and provide some examples if you have them as well. So again, thank you for answering the poll, and we'll continue on.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. So as Kelly was mentioning, we certainly are experiencing some new times and a bit of a shift in teaching and learning. As outlined in our Supplemental Learning Assessment Quick Reference Guide, we as teachers are really drawing on our professional discretion in order to determine appropriate assessment practices during these times. And although assessment might look a little bit different than working with our students face-to-face, really we can be rest assured that solid assessment practices remain the same. And regardless of how we're feeling in relation to assessing students, again, it looked like most of us were kind of in the area of developing confidence, we can draw on what we know in order to support our student learners in this online environments. So we'll look at the purpose of assessment, really whether engaging in face-to-face or online assessment practices, the purpose is the same essentially. Sound assessment practices help to improve learning, especially when they help students recognize where they're at and also where they're headed in order to reach their learning goals. Assessments support information gathering, as assessment can provide teachers and students with important details about student knowledge, about abilities and skills in order to help them create and support meaningful learning experiences for our learners. An assessment should inform instruction, This helps students move from where they are now to where they need to be in relation to their own learning. And another purpose of assessment is to monitor impact and measure success. So assessment can be used to measure student success and understanding as an individual or even as a group. With any learning, we're really hoping to help students identify what they know and determine what they need to know in order to get there into relation to their goals. So we can really guide students as they begin to take ownership of their learning. Assessment plays a key role in this learning journey by helping students to structure a pathway. And our hope really is to help develop assessment capable, visible learners. That's a mouthful, but it is quite important. This image here is of quite an incredible resource by Nancy Fry, John Hattie, and Doug Fisher. And we've used it as a reference for creating some of the information that we're sharing in this assessment series, as it supports sound assessment practices. And really, in order to build assessment capable, visible learners, we need a clear vision as to what that looks like. So we need to kind of imagine a learner, and we should be imagining a learner who knows his or her current level of understanding, has a good idea and understanding of where he or she is going, and possesses the confidence to do so. We want students to be able to identify and access tools needed to progress on his or her own personalized learning journey, and students who can effectively reflect on progress. So this webinar focuses on the importance of feedback as part of the assessment process and in helping to support assessment capable learners. It's worth noting the impact and the effect size of feedback. Hattie suggests that we as teachers can increase and maximize student learning by focusing on activities and practices within a zone of kind of desired effects. So these are kind of researched areas that have the greatest impact on learning. And providing our students with the right feedback at the right time can have a significant impact or effect on student learning. But really, it has to be manageable. And what we're going to do in this webinar series is explore feedback as it connects to assessment and to student achievement, noting the incredible effect size. And we'll move on to Melissa.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Assessment can really be broken down into a process. Like most of the things we do in education, we can break it down into some steps. Now, of course, flexibility is key within those steps. But it is worth noting that assessment shouldn't be something that's done to the student. I know traditionally it's something that the teacher would do or put a value on for the student kind of at the end of their learning. So we're trying to look more at assessment as the students becoming a very big part of that process and leading that process and having a really good understanding of what that process actually is, what it means, what it looked like, and their role in that process. So as I go through this process here, think of your students and how you can involve them as much as possible. And you can use that gradual release of control for them to start taking on a little bit more and a little bit more when they're ready of this assessment process. Because ultimately we need to be assessing ourselves to know if we're doing things correct in our life. We're not always going to have somebody there telling us. So we want them to just own this process and become a big part of it. So the first thing for being assessed is you have to know what you're actually learning. So sharing that I can or learning outcome with your students is really important, and making sure it's in language that they can understand. And if it's not, then working together to break that down together so that they get what that means. So the first thing is then just making sure that they know this is what you're actually working on. So someone to walk into your class and say, what are you learning? And the kids would say, we're learning this outcome. And they'd be able to put that into their own words and explain it. And you want to make sure that they can explain it back to you. That's quite key. The next thing you need to consider is you really need to set your kids up for success. You don't ever want to surprise them. Same as we don't want surprises on report cards, we don't want surprises on assessment for the kids. So you're going to set that success criteria together as a class. So if you're using a rubric, build that rubric together. They're going to own it that way. They're going to be involved, and they're going to know that what they're doing is going to be assessed in a way that they've had input in. They're going to feel like a little bit more ownership if they're involved in that. Set the learning goals together. Eventually, maybe the kids can do that all on their own, but clarify and make sure it's really clear. How do you know that you've met this outcome? They should be able to tell you that. Then you're going to have a look at some readiness assessments and seeing where they are in their journey and maybe what they need a little bit beforehand, or what they're ready to control and take on. So this is where your learner profiles will come into play with the kids. You're going to reflect on what you already know and what skills they already have to do their learning for this outcome. And maybe what do they need? What is something that they don't know, or a skill that they don't have? So again, clarify at this point with the kids, what do you need to do your learning? And then you're going to go into that formative loop. And this is where you're using that feedback from the students and observations and mini assessments to inform your learning and, form the student learning and have lots of small learning opportunities for the kids. So you're going to adjust your plan accordingly. You're going to monitor, and together with the students, you'll develop the next steps. And then eventually you'll head towards the summative. And is it the end? There's a question mark there because we don't know. So based on the student level of understanding, you're either going to have them extend or enrich their learning, move on to the next learning outcome, or go back a step into that formative learning loop where they might need to clarify a few things.
Okay, so I just wanted to reiterate for those of you who are on the call from SunWest, how integrated that process is with our Pebble implementation process. You saw everything from the readiness assessments, both the academic and the learner profile, who we are as learners, all the way to that transfer of responsibility between educator and student, looking at the I can statements, connecting to learning, and then teaching the students and working together with them in that we do environment to prepare them to take on more of the assessment pieces in their learning as they start self-directing. So I just wanted to reiterate that connection. And for those of you not in SunWest, we hope that there are connections for you as well. And we're thinking about our students working from home at this point. One of the pieces that we found that we kind of helped guide us on this assessment web series was this little video from Edutopia, and it's 6 tips or 6 ways to give effective feedback. It's a very short video, and we wanted to show it to you. And what we've done is broken it down. So we're going to look at tips 1 and 2 today, but we'll start by just watching the short video just to frame the next piece of our series today. So feedback shouldn't stress you out. Based on that video, I think you can see the alignment with the assessment feedback process that we just shared with you. But really thinking about right now and the state that we're in with regards to supplemental learning, and where families and students are selecting, whether or not they're being assessed. Even if they haven't chosen to be assessed, that feedback and the conferring is really important. and thinking about what are those things that you're really going to ask them to share feedback with you about, and what you're going to share feedback with them about. And so with that, we're going to move into talking about tip 1, which is the 1 in 4.
Okay, so as Kelly said, and you saw in the video, tip 1 is follow the 1 in 4 rule. So to follow the 1 in 4 rule, you're basically looking at giving in-depth feedback on 1 in 4 things. Not every single assignment that the students do needs you to break it down and get that purple pen out and write all over it. That being said, you are going to want to make sure that you still check that all 4 of those assignments are complete and have been done, because you want to build accountability in the students. So it doesn't mean that you're not necessarily checking that they've done their work, but you're not necessarily providing a lot of really good detailed feedback, which is quite time consuming. By eliminating that down to a little less often, you can do a little bit more with the ones that you do have. So just keeping this in mind, some of the strategies that I've used as a teacher that fall into this are my Friday 5s that I would do with my students teaching grade 7, 8 math. So we would work every day and we would do a warm up and the kids would do their work, and they were responsible for marking their daily work. And they could, of course, conference with me and we'd have mini lessons going to support that. But how I knew the kids were doing what they should and that they had a grasp on the concepts was my Friday 5. So I would give them a mini assessment with the, I guess with the piece that it could have part A and B. So there are 5 questions, but they could have lots of different parts within that question. Those questions, but the 5 questions could cover anything that we had done for the year. So kids didn't have the luxury of forgetting, and I would make sure that they actually did have that concept. It's not that they just were able to do it at the end of the week. And the questions would focus on what we had been working on that week, or what the groups had been working on that week, but we'd be pulling things back in to ensure that mastery learning. So that really saved a lot of time and gave me really good information, because then I could set up my conferences with the kids based on what they need to know or what they seem to be struggling with based on that Friday 5. So they are able to take on some of that correcting themselves. And now, some students just aren't necessarily able to handle that, but you know your kids and you know which ones you would need to check up on. And by doing something like this, you have a little more time to do that with those students that do need a little bit more of you.
So similar to the Edutopia video, we've asked teachers in SunWest to think about some tips that they'd like to share. I've invited you to think about that in the chat, so feel free to add there. But at this time, we are going to invite one of our attendees. We'll go to the next slide. We're going to ask Jennifer Loken, who is Pebble mentor and teacher at Westcliff School in Marengo, to share some of the ways she's used the 1 in 4 rule. So take it away, Jen, and thank you.
Good morning. I hope my internet connection holds out for you guys. Let me know if you lose me or can't hear me. I was just thinking while I was watching the Edutopia video about how I use the 1 in 4 rule in especially middle year and high school ELA, which is where I mostly teach. And one way I use it in my classroom is that if I'm looking for comprehension outcomes, I don't usually bother to mark their grammar or their spelling. I might circle something or note something, but I wouldn't maybe mark it for them. I'd just maybe point it out or save that for another time. So for example, if I were asking them to write down or highlight themes from Of Mice and Men for me, I wouldn't be concerned about whether or not they were phrasing their sentences correctly. I'd be looking for the comprehension of that assignment. Or if I was looking for examples of mood in Edgar Allan Poe short story, I wouldn't be overly concerned with their spelling and grammar, which is great because some kids comprehend things, as you all know, quite well, but don't necessarily have all the grammatical skills that well them to have. When I'm assessing presentation outcomes, I look for specific things I asked for. I may formatively assess them in other areas, but I wouldn't take every single assignment and assess it thoroughly. It's very time consuming, especially in ELA. So one thing I wanted to point out is that we have a ton of rubrics created and built out in our ELA hub for every ELA outcome from grades 1 through 12. And some of them are even by indicator. And I often download those and alter them to meet the needs of my assignment, and quite often do those with the students as well, so that they're working towards what I'm actually going to assess, or they're assessing themselves before they turn it in, so that it's really fitting our need. And that's how they know they've met the outcome. When I watched the Edutopia video, I found that the 1 in 4 rule and hand in hand, because if the students know what they're going to be assessed on, then oftentimes the marking of that specific outcome was much easier, because that's what I was or thought of when I was watching the video. And guys.
Thank you, Jen. Appreciate you providing us with some tips. Does anybody else want to jump in quickly, either in the chat or using the mic, to share a quick tip that they might have with regards to the 1 in 4 rule?
Okay, well, with that, we'll transition into tip number 2, which is periodically let students self-assess. And self-assessment, as we know, is a really important part of building assessment-capable learners. And it can be really beneficial to have students self-reflect on their own work. To build on that, it's quite amazing when students can choose their own outcomes and their learning goals and monitor their progress. And there's lots of different ways for students to keep track of their progress by sharing a description or whatnot in some fashion. Sometimes it could be in a notebook like suggested, but other times it could be something maybe online in Teams, or maybe showing progress using something more visual like a progress bar. There's lots of different ways that this can be done. And we are going to reach out to some teachers in order to gain some tips as well. So Kelly?
So again, we put a call out to some teachers and our Pebble mentors to see if anyone would be willing to share some of their tips around tip 2. And we'll just go to the next slide. Courtney McDonald, who is Pebble mentor and ELA teacher, and I think a little bit of science right now, from Northwest Central School, is going to share some of her tips with us.
Good morning. Thanks, Kelly. Okay, so I have 2 different parts kind of to my teacher tips to share with you all today. The first one is in regards to having students self-assess and reflect on their own work. And my example of how students complete self-assessments is with my senior ELA classes. So as we've kind of heard already this morning, but sharing that rubric with students and allowing them to see how they'll be assessed is really important. And I do that with my senior ELA classes with each assignment that they get. And I've been using, for the most part, the SunWest 4-point rubrics that are on our resource bank in the ELA hub. I think, Jen, you referenced those as well, so that's kind of neat.
Courtney,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Did you want to share your screen? I know you had asked. Yeah. I just thought I didn't get you to share your screen. So do you want to do that?
Yep, you bet. I was going to wait till after, but I can now. It either way doesn't matter.
Oh, whenever you want. I just didn't want to forget that.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So I can, and I will show you. This is one of the rubrics that I've had a student kind of do their self-reflection on. So first I'll share the rubric with my students, and we'll either use, like I said, the 4-point rubric from SunWest, or we would also sometimes create and co-create our own rubrics together. So that was a second example below for a co-created rubric. And as students complete their assignment, then they are able to reflect on the rubric throughout that process. And then at the very end, I require all students hand in a self-assessment rubric before I even mark their assignment itself. So after having done this for a couple of years now, I've noticed that students not only are improving on their ELA writing abilities, but also on their self-reflection skills. So again, the first rubric is just for literary analysis that I had students do. And the pink was the student's self-assessment. And then the blue check marks are my assessment over top of them. So you can see they're getting really good at this. Now that these students that I'm showing you are in grade 12, I've taught them for 3 years. So they're kind of getting used to how they use the rubrics and how they sit. So lots of them are very true to how they do. And then the one below, they didn't highlight on this one, but you'll notice that for each of the categories, it says, how did you achieve this mark? And then their comment or their feedback is underneath. So the student had picked a 3, a 1 because they hadn't asked any questions in the discussion, and then a 3 again. And then I'll just share with you my second part to my teacher tips. And this one is connecting student self-assessment to learning goals and tracking their progress. So if I scroll up, kind of did these in the opposite order when I posted them. The example that I had to share with you is when I did some ELA pullout through my Pebble and student support role. So students were able to use this tracking chart to record their reading score for their DRA. So we didn't do DRAs in every single month, but the October DRA, they were able to kind of highlight in here, and then we do them again in December. So I guess it's every second month or so. But anyhow, when I started doing this with students, they wanted to do it every month so they could see their growth per month, which I thought was pretty neat. And I don't mind sharing this out. You might notice, well, these aren't DRA scores on the side. So you have to use the Learning A to Z correlation chart. And you just find the DRA score here. And then if your student had a DRA score of 14, then they would color in up to H, the letter H on the chart. So if in October they got to H, they'd color into there. And then we would discuss going into your December DRA, what might be a good goal for you if you had an H last time. It's neat for students to see, well, I might, like some of them might say, I think I'm going to get an L. So I'm like, okay, well, we'll do your DRA and then we'll see. And then maybe they only got to I or J. Then the next time they set their goal, it was more realistic. So it's just a really nice way for students to engage in their learning and also just to see that growth for themselves. I found that before I used this type of assessment with them in tracking, that their DRA just seems somewhat connected to their ELA, and they're in grade 2, so I can understand that. But then after encouraging them to take part in it and set goals, we shared these on Seesaw with their parents, then their kind of engagement with it and their ability to want to do better really improved, and they could connect their DRA to all of their different ELA reading. And it's too bad I didn't have one that was kind of colored in or had any goals written with it, but those ones were at the school, so I just had to copy an empty one. But those are the 2 tips, or the 2 tips I wanted to share today. Thanks.
Thank you, Courtney. Wonderful to have a couple of examples, one in early years and one in senior years. Your role is vast and you cover lots of grades. So thank you to both our teachers, Jen and Courtney, for sharing tips with us today. Does anybody else have any tips they would like to jump on the mic and share, or to share in the chat?
I just have one, Kelly, that my students and their families absolutely loved. And that was, I love to involve my grades 6 to 8, anywhere in there, involve the students in the report card writing process. So I would do my grades, calculate my grades, and I would have my comments and their FAFSA marks, which are their factors affecting student behavior. I'd have it all ready to go. And I would give them, I made up basically a blank report card template for whatever subject I happened to be teaching, or if I had core, they would do their whole own report card. And then we would conference together, and if there was something, they were usually harder on themselves, which I've always found interesting. But as we did it, the accuracy of their ability to predict their grades was phenomenal. And when you look at Hattie's research, I think it's an outstanding 1.44 impact. Like, it's huge impact for their success. We found that this was a really great way where if we were really far apart and we disagreed, we could have a little conference, and often the kids would convince me. I'd be like, you're right, I was maybe being too hard on you, or you're right, maybe I was being too easy on you. And they didn't like that when that happened. But it was such a valuable process, and the students were so empowered, and I would send their copy of their report card home along with mine, and they absolutely loved that. That was one of my favorite tips for that.
All right, so we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so now Melissa's going to talk a little bit about some of the resources, great resources that align with what we've been talking about this morning, the assessment process, and a multitude of other resources in our resource bank. She's going to bring that up and talk a little bit about it, and I will share the link with you in the chat.
I'm just going to do a very brief overview. Our assessment hub launched right at the beginning of all of the insanity with COVID-19. So I think a lot of people don't know that it is there, but there is a very solid start to a great assessment hub. Of course, as we keep adding resources, it's going to get stronger and stronger. Kelly's going to put the link in the chat, but if you need to find it, just go to Resource Bank and click Hubs and see all, and you'll see like a little purple brain. And that'll bring you to the assessment hub. And these are the collections that are there. There's some great stuff and best practices. A lot of what we talked about and a lot that was used to build out that process for assessment comes from the information in there, along with John Hattie. So then you'll see there's just some great collections to support you. So everything from division assessments, so that's where you'd find our D or our A stuff, or the reading assessments, for example. The formative assessment is a really fun collection because it's full of great web-based formative assessment that you can do with kids. Again, all of our ministry supports are there, easy for you to find. We've got some readiness assessments, some 21st century skills. So all of the rubrics that we've built out with our 21st century skills Pebble committee are in there and accessible for everybody. And then some information on summative. So, and then of course, My School SAS, which we're working our way through. So there's all kinds of things here for you to just kind of explore. And when you're, kind of going, ooh, I wonder where this is, or I need an idea for that for assessment, you just hopefully can come here and get some great ideas.
Thanks, thanks, Melissa. So at this time, we're opening it up for questions. Do you have any questions for us or for the teachers that shared their tips with us? Mic is open and chat box is open. We'll just take a moment to see if there's any questions. Okay, well, seeing none, just to remind you that we will post the recording of this session, session 1 of our 4-part series in the on-demand section of our PD site. And We would love to see you back next Thursday at the same time, where we'll look at tips 2 and 3, or 3 and 4, using tech tools strategically and peer feedback and assessment. We will have some more teachers joining us with their tips. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody who was involved and everyone who participated with us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day.